Fate has a cruel way of giving us exactly what we need at the moment we least expect it. In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by the silent creep of greed, a legend was being forged in the crucible of dust and sunlight. Before the harvest can be reaped, a tribute must be paid. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, in the quiet power of truth against the roar of arrogance, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing, for the most vital secrets are always buried deep within the land. Now, prepare yourselves. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that settled on the shoulders and pressed down, down into the cracked, thirsty soil of the Sterling Vineyards. It was a predator, shimmering in waves above the endless rows of grapevines, distorting the world into a wavering mirage of shimmering green and scorched red earth. For Maria Flores, the heat was a familiar blanket, thick and suffocating, but it was a constant she could rely on. It was the human element, capricious and cruel, that remained unpredictable. The sun did not judge. It simply burned. Mr. Gentry, on the other hand, judged with the ferocity of a starved hawk, his gaze a weapon that sought out weakness and punished it without mercy. "Flores, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" His voice was a gravelly tear in the fabric of the afternoon quiet, a sound that made muscles tighten all the way down the line of workers. A collective flinch, invisible but deeply felt. Maria didn't move, her hands remaining steady around the tiny, trembling body of the fledgling sparrow. It had fallen from its nest in the high wires, a dusty puff of feathers with a twig-like leg bent at an unnatural angle. She had found it during her pass, its silent, wide-eyed panic a stark contrast to the indifferent buzzing of the cicadas and the rustling of the leaves. It was a small, broken thing in a vast, unforgiving world. She understood. She gently placed it in the shade of a broad grape leaf, her movements economical and precise, a habit born from years of handling delicate things. "It was injured, sir," she said, her voice soft, nearly stolen by the sheer vastness of the field. "Injured?" Gentry stomped closer, his heavy work boots kicking up clouds of red dust that clung to the sweat on her arms, branding her with the soil. He was a thick man, his face perpetually flushed with sun, and a simmering indignation that seemed to be his natural state. He pointed a sausage-like finger at the row she had yet to inspect, his nail dirty and cracked. "I don't pay you to be a veterinarian to every worthless creature that drops out of the sky. I pay you to check for mites, for fungus, for anything that might cost Mr. Sterling a single damn penny. That row is 5 minutes behind schedule because of you. 5 minutes." He spat the words like they were poison, each one a small, deliberate act of violence. "That's coming out of your pay. Maybe a few dollars less in your pocket will help you focus on the job you're actually paid to do." Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at the back of her eyes, a familiar sting. It wasn't about the money, the few dollars were meaningless. It was the deliberate cruelty, the casual degradation performed on a public stage for the benefit of the other workers, who now kept their heads down, their hands moving faster, their spines rigid with a shared fear and a selfish relief that it wasn't them. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become. Maria simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the cracked earth, a canvas of hardship she knew intimately. Arguing was pointless. It would only make it worse, turn the simmering contempt into a full-blown conflagration. She turned back to the vines, her throat tight, the foreman's triumphant sneer burning into the back of her neck like a brand. He saw a slow worker, a sentimental woman, a nobody. He saw exactly what she needed him to see. As she reached for the next vine, forcing her focus back to the task, the glint of sun on metal from the main road caught her eye. A procession of sleek black cars was turning onto the long private drive, churning the dust into a fine, floating mist. The polished chrome and tinted windows were so out of place in this world of sweat and soil, they looked like spacecraft from another planet, alien and sterile. Gentry saw them too. His entire posture changed, a metamorphosis as sudden as it was grotesque. The petty tyrant vanished, replaced in an instant by a fawning, anxious subordinate. His shoulders straightened. He wiped his sweaty palms on his dusty jeans, and a sickeningly sweet smile stretched across his face, pulling at the corners of his mouth like a grimace. "Look sharp, everyone," he barked, his voice now a desperate, cheerful boom that echoed unnaturally in the heat. "The big man is here, Mr. Sterling himself." The arrival of the corporate entourage was like a shift in the weather. The oppressive, monotonous heat of the afternoon was suddenly charged with a new kind of energy, cold, electric, and fraught with peril. Daniel Sterling, the CEO of the multinational conglomerate that owned this land, emerged from the lead sedan. He was a man tailored for boardrooms, not vineyards. His suit was a sharp, urban gray, an armor against the world's imperfections. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, seemed to defy the dust, which dared not settle on their immaculate surface. He moved with an air of impatient ownership, his eyes scanning the rows of vines not with a farmer's love, but with an accountant's calculation, tallying future profits and potential losses. Behind him trailed a small group of executives, men and women in similar attire, their expressions a carefully curated blend of deference and ambition. They looked deeply uncomfortable, blinking in the unfiltered sunlight like creatures disturbed from a deep cave, their city-soft hands held awkwardly at their sides. Mr. Gentry scurried toward them, his earlier bluster replaced with a near-comical obsequiousness. He practically bowed, his thick body contorting in a display of subservience. "Mr. Sterling, welcome, sir. An honor to have you out during the harvest preparations. Everything is looking prime. A banner year, I'm telling you. A banner year." Daniel Sterling gave a curt nod, his attention already drifting past the foreman, his mind clearly on other, more important matters. "Gentry, good. I've brought my father along. He wanted to see the old place." From the second car, an older man was being helped out by a discreetly uniformed caregiver. This was Arthur Sterling, the founder, the patriarch, the man who had planted the first rootstock in this very soil with his own 2 hands decades ago, when this was all just dirt and a dream. He was frail now, his tall frame stooped, his hands trembling slightly with the palsy of age. But his eyes, a pale, watery blue, were sharp. They weren't looking at the balance sheets in the air. They were reading the leaves, the soil, the very soul of the vineyard. He carried a heavy, polished cane but leaned on it more for reassurance than support. Maria watched from her row, her hands never ceasing their methodical inspection of the underside of the leaves. She was invisible to them, just another part of the landscape, a figure in a sun-faded shirt and wide-brimmed hat. It was a camouflage she had perfected over years of necessity. Anonymity was a kind of freedom, a shield against questions she had no desire to answer. She preferred the silent language of the plants, their honest signals of thirst or sickness. They couldn't lie. They couldn't betray. "It's good to have you, Mr. Arthur," Gentry gushed, turning his sycophantic attention to the old man. "Your legacy is in good hands, sir, growing stronger every year." Arthur Sterling didn't seem to hear him. His gaze was distant, troubled, as if listening to a faint, discordant note in a familiar symphony. He shuffled forward, leaving the neat gravel of the path and stepping directly onto the tilled earth. His caregiver made a move to stop him to protect his expensive shoes, but Daniel waved him off with a subtle gesture. "Let him be," the CEO murmured, a hint of weary affection in his voice. "It does him good to feel the dirt." The old man moved slowly along one of the rows, Maria's row. He ignored the plump, heavy bunches of grapes hanging in the dappled light, the obvious fruits of a successful season. His attention was fixed on the leaves, the vineyard's circulatory system. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one, his fingers tracing its veins with the delicacy of a lover or a doctor searching for a pulse. He plucked a leaf, then another, turning them over and over, holding them up to the unforgiving sun. A frown creased his deeply wrinkled brow. He looked less like a retired founder on a nostalgic tour and more like a physician diagnosing a terminal patient. The air grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the heat. Maria felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same laser-focused dread she had seen in her own, so many years ago, in another country, another life, standing in a field just like this one as her own world crumbled to dust. The old man's breath began to quicken, catching in his chest. He held the leaves aloft, his hands shaking so violently they fluttered as if in a phantom breeze. His watery blue eyes darted around, wide with a primal terror that silenced the chirping of the cicadas. The corporate smiles of the executives began to falter, their masks of professional interest slipping to reveal expressions of awkward concern. Daniel Sterling's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "Dad," he said, his voice gentle but firm, an attempt to anchor the old man in the present. "What is it? Are you all right?" But Arthur Sterling wasn't listening. He was in another time, another place, fighting a ghost only he could see. He stumbled back, his face ashen, the leaves clutched in his fist like a damning piece of evidence presented to a blind jury. "It's here," he whispered, the sound a ragged gasp that was barely audible. "It's here again." The whisper escalated into a cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror that ripped through the placid afternoon. "The rot, the black rot, don't you see it? It's on the leaves. It's come back." His shout echoed across the fields, a raw, painful sound that seemed to make the very air tremble. The other workers froze, their faces turning towards the commotion, their own fears reflected in their wide eyes. The executives exchanged nervous glances, shifting their weight from one polished shoe to the other. They weren't looking at the leaves. They were looking at the old man, their expressions a toxic mixture of pity and embarrassment. This was not on the itinerary. "He's having one of his episodes," one of them muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The poison of dismissal. Poor man," another added, shaking his head slightly. "The mind, you know." Daniel Sterling's face was a mask of strained composure, but a hairline crack was beginning to show. He moved to his father's side, trying to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Dad, it's okay. The vines are fine. They're healthy, the best they've been in years. Let's get you back to the car, get you some water." But Arthur shoved his son's hand away with surprising strength, a burst of adrenaline fueled by terror. "No, you're not listening. You never listen." His voice was filled with a lifetime of frustration. "Look." He thrust the handful of leaves at them, a desperate prophet showing proof of the apocalypse. "The blight, it starts small, just a little spot, and then it spreads. It'll take everything, just like in '82. It'll ruin us." Mr. Gentry saw his chance to be the hero, to control the situation and earn the CEO's gratitude. He stepped forward, his voice a condescending coo, the tone one uses for a frightened child or a madman. Now, Mr. Arthur, let's not get ourselves worked up. The plants are perfect. My men and I, we check them every single day. There's no rot here, you're just confused." The word hung in the air, ugly and dismissive. Confused asterisk. It was a diagnosis and a dismissal all in one. To the executives, it confirmed what they already suspected. The celebrated founder was senile, his mind lost in the phantom battles of the past. They offered weak, sympathetic smiles to Daniel, the kind one gives to a man burdened by a difficult family situation. It was a social problem, not a business one. Gentry, emboldened by their silent agreement, tried to take the old man's arm. "Let's get you out of this sun, sir. You've had a long day." This was the final indignity. Arthur Sterling recoiled as if he'd been struck, a deep, guttural roar building in his chest. "Get away from me," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a potent mix of fear and fury. "You're blind, all of you. You'll let it kill my vines. You'll kill everything I built." He was spiraling, lost in a panic attack that was feeding on their disbelief, their pity a cage he couldn't break out of. Gentry looked at Daniel Sterling, a frantic, helpless expression on his face. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know what to do. Maybe we should just..." He gestured vaguely toward the car, his only solution to hide the problem, to make the unpleasantness disappear. He wanted to shield the powerful son from the embarrassing madness of the father. It was in that moment that Maria moved. She didn't think, she reacted. A force older than reason, deeper than fear, compelled her forward, an instinct honed in labs and fields half a world away. She laid her pruning shears silently on the ground and began to walk toward the knot of tailored suits and rising panic. She kept her eyes down, her steps measured, a humble field hand approaching the court of the king. "What do you think you're doing?" Gentry hissed, his body instantly blocking her path. He loomed over her, a wall of angry flesh and cheap authority. "Get back to your row. This is not your concern." His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her sun-browned skin like talons. The grip was a clear and brutal warning. "I said get back to work." The pressure was immense, a casual display of force meant to intimidate, to remind her of her place. But Maria didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge the pain. She looked past the furious foreman, her gaze locking onto the trembling hands of the old man. She saw the leaves he was clutching, and in that instant the world fell away. There was no Gentry, no CEO, no smirking executives. There was only the leaf, and the truth it held. A truth she knew in her bones, in her blood, in the phantom memories of a life she had buried beneath layers of dirt and sweat and silence. She met Gentry's furious glare with a calm she didn't know she possessed. "Let go of me, Mr. Gentry," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that stunned him into a momentary loosening of his grip. It was an alien sound coming from this woman, and the shock of it gave her the opening she needed. She slipped past him, moving with a fluid grace that was utterly at odds with her grimy work clothes. She stopped a respectful distance from Arthur Sterling, who was now weeping, his shoulders shaking with ragged sobs of frustration and despair. The caregiver was hovering, unsure how to intervene. Daniel looked utterly lost, the captain of industry powerless against the storms of his father's mind. Maria didn't look at any of them. She looked at the old man. She didn't speak to the confused patriarch. She spoke to the expert, the farmer who knew his land better than any man alive. "Sir," she began, her voice the gentle murmur of a stream over stones, "may I see the leaves?" Arthur Sterling flinched, his head snapping up. He looked at her, his wild eyes focusing for the first time. He saw not a threat, not a dismissive face, but a quiet woman whose expression held no pity, only a deep, profound seriousness. He hesitated, his fist still clenched, then slowly, tentatively, uncurled his fingers. The leaves were crumpled and stained with sweat, but the evidence was there. Maria knelt on the dry earth, a gesture of deference that was also intensely practical. It brought her eye level with the leaves in his hand, into his world. The executives watched, bewildered by this strange turn of events. Gentry was vibrating with suppressed rage, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Daniel Sterling stood frozen, a statue of conflicted duty, caught between two worlds he didn't fully understand. Maria pointed with a dirt-caked finger, her touch infinitely gentle as she indicated a minuscule, almost invisible spot near the stem of one of the leaves. It was no bigger than a pinprick, a tiny brown lesion with a darker border. To the untrained eye it was nothing, a bug bite, a sunspot, a meaningless imperfection in a world full of them. "You're right, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick, awkward silence. The words were a balm, a validation that instantly calmed the storm in the old man's eyes. He stared at her, his breathing beginning to even out, his frantic terror receding. Someone heard him. Someone saw. She looked up from the leaf, her gaze bypassing the old man and locked directly onto the CEO, Daniel Sterling. Her gaze was unflinching, holding the powerful man captive. He is not confused. It is the rot. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the lungs. It was as if a bell had been struck, the ringing tone vibrating through every person standing in that sun-drenched row. The nervous energy, the pity, the embarrassment, it all evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of collective breath. Gentry's face, which had been purple with rage, now paled to a sickly, mottled white. The executives' smirks had vanished, their expressions now a blank canvas of shock. Daniel Sterling stared at Maria, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not a field hand, but an enigma. The quiet certainty in her voice was more powerful, more terrifying than all of Gentry's blustering assurances. "What did you say?" Daniel's voice was low, taut, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Maria rose to her feet, still holding the leaf she had gently taken from Arthur's hand. She turned it over, angling it so the sunlight illuminated its surface, a scientist presenting her data. *Gignardia bidwellii, she said, the Latin name rolling off her tongue with a familiarity that was jarringly out of place, a jewel discovered in a pile of dust. "Black rot. Your father is correct. It begins like this." She gestured again to the tiny lesion. "This is the initial infection point, likely from a spore that overwintered on a mummy berry from last season. It looks like nothing now. In a few days, you will see pycnidia, the fruiting bodies of the fungus, appear as tiny black dots within the lesion. From there, it spreads exponentially, especially with the morning dew and high humidity we've been having." She spoke with the detached precision of a lecturer in a university hall, her words painting a clinical, terrifying picture of a silent, microscopic invasion. She walked a few steps down the row, her eyes scanning the foliage with an expert swiftness, a process that took others an hour compressed into seconds. She plucked another leaf, and then another. "Here," she said, showing them to Daniel, her hand steady. "And here. The pattern is classic. They're concentrated in this lower quadrant of the field, probably where the air circulation is poorest. The experts you have on staff would miss this. They're looking for the obvious signs, the large necrotic spots, the shriveling of the fruit. By the time you see that, it's too late. You've already lost 20, maybe 30% of your crop. But the initial infection, the signature, is subtle. You have to know what you are looking for." Her explanation was a cascade of information, delivered without ego, without flourish, just the simple, unadorned truth. She was translating the secret language of the vineyard, a language the suits and their spreadsheets could never comprehend. Arthur Sterling watched her, his expression transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a look of profound, heart-wrenching relief. He was not crazy. He was not lost in the past. He was a farmer who knew his land, and this quiet woman in the dirt-stained clothes was the only one who had listened. One of the executives, a man with a PhD in agricultural business from a prestigious university, stepped forward, his skepticism reasserting itself, an attempt to reclaim the intellectual high ground. That's highly specific. Those could be anything: nutrient deficiency, insect damage. Maria didn't even look at him. Her focus remained on the CEO, the only man who mattered. A nutrient deficiency would present as chlorosis, a yellowing, typically starting from the edges of the leaf or in a pattern along the veins. Insect damage would show signs of chewing or stippling from mites. This is different. Look at the halo. She held the first leaf up again. See this faint, almost imperceptible ring around the lesion? That's the plant's defensive response. It's trying to wall off the fungus. It's the calling card of a pathogenic infection. She finally turned her gaze to the executive, her eyes calm but direct, the student effortlessly schooling the teacher. In a lab under a microscope, you would see the conidia. But out here, in the field, this halo is your first and most reliable warning. It's a warning that has been ignored. The last few words were delivered with a quiet weight that landed like a physical blow. The accusation was unmistakable, hanging in the hot, still air. A cold dread began to creep into Daniel Sterling's eyes, extinguishing the anger and replacing it with a chilling fear. He looked from Maria to the leaf, then to his father, who was now standing straighter, his breathing normal, his gaze fixed on Maria with something akin to awe. And then his eyes, now like chips of ice, settled on Mr. Gentry. The foreman was sweating profusely, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a cornered animal. He couldn't meet the CEO's gaze. The pieces began to click into place for Daniel, forming a picture he did not want to see. The vague field reports from Gentry over the past few weeks, mentions of some minor leaf spotting and cosmetic blemishes due to the heat. Assurances that everything was under control, that yields were projected to be higher than ever. It had all been a lie, a cover-up born of incompetence and fear. Gentry hadn't been protecting the vineyard. He had been protecting his own job, hoping the problem would either disappear or be unnoticeable until it was too late to blame him. The silence stretched thick and heavy. The sun beat down. A single drop of sweat traced a path through the dust on Gentry's temple. Finally, Daniel Sterling spoke, his voice dangerously soft. "How?" he asked, the single word directed at Maria. "How do you know this?" Maria hesitated. For years, her past had been a locked room, the key thrown away. She had built a new life, a simple life, a life of anonymity where the ghosts of what she'd lost couldn't find her. To open that door now, here, in the middle of a dusty field, felt like a betrayal of the quiet peace she had so painstakingly constructed. It felt like uncovering a wound that had never truly healed. But then she looked at Arthur Sterling, at the dignity that had been restored to him, at the truth that deserved to be heard. The vineyard was dying. Silence was no longer an option. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and sun-baked leaves. "My name is Dr. Maria Flores," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried with the force of a thunderclap that echoed in the sudden silence. "Before I came to this country, I was the head of the National Phytopathology Institute in my homeland. I ran a laboratory. We specialized in fungal and viral pathogens in commercial agriculture, specifically in viticulture." The revelation hung in the air, stunning the assembled group into absolute stillness. Dr. Maria Flores, head of an institute, a scientist, here picking leaves for a few dollars an hour, enduring the petty cruelties of a man like Gentry. It was incomprehensible. The story didn't make sense. The social and professional hierarchies they all understood had just been violently inverted. Daniel Sterling stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman standing before him, in her faded work shirt, her hands calloused and stained with soil, with the image her words conjured. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "You ran a lab," he stammered, the question sounding foolish even to his own ears. Maria nodded, a flicker of old pain crossing her features, a shadow passing over the sun. There was a change in government, political instability. Funding for scientific research was cut. My work was deemed non-essential. My husband, who was also a scientist, spoke out against the new regime. It became unsafe for us. We had to leave everything behind. Our work, our home, our names. Her gaze became distant for a moment, looking back across a border of time and tragedy. He did not survive the journey here. I took what work I could find. Work where no one asks questions. Work where you can be invisible. Her story was delivered without self-pity, a simple statement of fact, but it painted a devastating picture of loss, of a brilliant mind forced into exile, of expertise buried under layers of tragedy and hardship. She was not just a field hand. She was a refugee, a widow, a scientist of the highest caliber, hiding in plain sight. The pieces of the puzzle now formed a horrifyingly clear image in Daniel's mind. He turned his head slowly, his movements deliberate and cold, until his eyes locked onto Mr. Gentry. The foreman flinched as if he'd been physically struck. The fawning sycophant was gone, replaced by a terrified man who knew, with sickening certainty, that his world was about to end. "Gentry," Daniel said, and his voice was like the scraping of steel on stone. "Dr. Flores says this warning has been ignored. Did you see these spots?" Gentry's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. "Sir, it was nothing," he finally managed to croak, his lies thin and brittle. "Just a few spots. The heat, you know, it happens every year. I didn't want to bother you with minor field details." "Minor details." Daniel's voice rose, shedding its controlled calm and taking on a dangerous edge. "My father, who has forgotten more about these vines than you will ever know, saw it from 100 yards away. A seasonal worker who happens to be one of the world's leading experts on the subject, identified it in seconds. And you, the foreman in charge of the health of this entire vineyard, you call it a minor detail." "I had it under control, sir, I swear," Gentry pleaded, his voice cracking. He was shrinking, physically diminishing under the weight of the CEO's glare. "I sprayed a general fungicide. I thought it would take care of it." Maria spoke again, her voice cutting through Gentry's pathetic defense with the clean precision of a scalpel. "A general fungicide would be useless against this pathogen once it's taken hold," she stated calmly. "It requires a specific, systemic treatment program, an immediate, aggressive pruning of the infected areas to stop the spread of the spores. Every day you wait, the potential for crop loss doubles." Every word she spoke was another nail in Gentry's coffin. Daniel Sterling looked at the terrified foreman, but he wasn't just seeing a negligent employee. He was seeing the man who had dismissed his father as a senile old fool. The man who had tried to hide a potential catastrophe that could cost the company millions, all to save his own skin. The man who had humiliated and bullied a woman like Dr. Flores, a woman whose knowledge was worth more than his entire salary. The anger in Daniel's chest was a cold, pure fire. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal, the disrespect, the profound systemic failure that Gentry represented. "You docked her pay today, didn't you?" Daniel asked, the question coming out of left field yet perfectly on target. Gentry froze, his eyes wide. "Sir, I heard you yelling when we pulled up. You docked her pay for being too slow, for helping an injured bird." Gentry's face went slack with shock and terror. He had been so sure no one of importance had noticed his petty display of power. He had no defense. He could only stand there, mute and condemned. Daniel Sterling took a step closer to him, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You stood in my father's vineyard, on the land he cultivated from nothing, and you allowed a disease to fester because you were either too stupid to see it or too cowardly to report it. You belittled the one person on this entire property who could save it, while simultaneously dismissing the man who built it. You are the disease, Gentry." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of them crush the foreman. "Pack your things, get off my property. You're fired." The words were final. There was no appeal, no negotiation. Gentry stared, his mouth agape, his face a mess of disbelief and ruin. He looked around as if searching for an ally, but the executives avoided his gaze, their faces impassive masks. Arthur Sterling watched him with cold, clear eyes. And Maria simply stood, her expression unreadable. Gentry's ruined face crumpled. With a choked sob, he turned and stumbled away, a man who had just lost everything. He didn't look back. He just walked, his heavy boots kicking up dust, a symbol of a broken system being excised from the land it had poisoned. The entourage watched him go, the silence broken only by the sound of his retreating footsteps on the dry gravel. His departure left a vacuum, a space filled with uncertainty and the terrifying scope of the problem he had left behind. After Gentry had disappeared from view, a broken figure trudging toward a future he had single-handedly destroyed. A profound and heavy silence settled over the vineyard once more. The crisis of the moment had passed, but the larger, more insidious crisis remained, lurking unseen on thousands of leaves, a silent, creeping death. Daniel Sterling felt as if he had been holding his breath for an hour. He let it out slowly, the air tasting of dust and dawning disaster. He looked at the vast expanse of green, the source of his family's wealth and legacy, and for the first time, he saw it not as a secure asset on a balance sheet, but as a fragile, living thing on the verge of collapse. He turned to Maria. She was still standing quietly, as if waiting for a dismissal, ready to fade back into the anonymity of the fields. The contrast between her humble posture and the immense power of her knowledge was staggering. He felt a wave of shame for his own blindness, for the system he perpetuated that allowed a woman of her caliber to be so undervalued, so abused. "Dr. Flores," he began, the honorific feeling both necessary and inadequate. I don't know what to say. I am so sorry for how you were treated, for what you've had to endure." Maria simply inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not forgiveness. "There is no need to apologize for the actions of others, Mr. Sterling. The immediate concern is the vineyard." Her focus was absolute, her professionalism a quiet rebuke to the emotional chaos of the past hour. She was right. Apologies were a luxury, action was a necessity. "Yes, of course," Daniel said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time all day. He felt like a boy playing at being a CEO. "What do we do? Can it be saved?" The question was raw, stripped of all corporate pretense. He was no longer a CEO talking about assets. He was a son asking a doctor if a loved one could be saved from a terminal illness. "It is possible," Maria replied, her gaze sweeping across the rows, her mind already calculating, strategizing. "But it will require immediate and decisive action. The infection is advanced but appears to be localized for now. We need to quarantine this section immediately. No equipment, no personnel move from this area to any other part of the vineyard without full decontamination. We need to start an aggressive pruning regimen to remove as much of the infected foliage as possible. And we need to begin a targeted application of the correct systemic fungicides, not just sprayed on top, but delivered in a way the plant will absorb. It will be a battle." She spoke with a quiet, calm authority that was more commanding than Gentry's loudest shouts had ever been. She wasn't offering opinions. She was outlining a strategy, a plan of war against an invisible enemy. The executives, who had been silent observers, now listened with rapt attention, their business school knowledge useless in the face of this primal, biological threat. Daniel looked at his team of highly paid agricultural consultants and business managers. They looked back at him, their expressions blank. They had no answers. Their expertise was in market projections, logistics, and profit margins. They knew how to sell the grapes, but they had no idea how to save them. There was only one person in this entire valley, perhaps in this entire state, who did. And she was holding a diseased leaf in her dirt-stained hands. He made a decision. It was not a decision born of analytics or financial models. It was a gut instinct, a recognition of profound, undeniable competence that transcended resumes and pay grades. "Dr. Flores," he said, his voice firm, resolute, "I don't want your advice. I want your leadership. I am offering you the position of head of plant pathology for Sterling Vineyards, effective immediately. You will have a full budget, a dedicated team, whatever equipment you need. You will have my full authority to do whatever you deem necessary to save this crop. Name your price. It's yours." The offer was so sudden, so monumental, that it seemed to stun even Maria. Her composure finally cracked, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. She looked from Daniel to his father, then out at the vines, the source of her recent humiliation and now her potential salvation. For years she had been a ghost, a shadow of her former self, defined only by her loss. The scientist within her had been dormant, a sleeping giant. Now it had been awakened. She thought of the years of silence, the grinding labor, the constant, dull ache of loss. She thought of her husband, Javier, of their shared passion, of the lab they had built together. She thought of the little sparrow she had tried to save, a small act of empathy that had cost her money but had, in some strange twist of fate, led her to this exact moment. A moment of impossible choice. Remain a ghost, or step back into the light and risk being seen, risk failing again. A slow smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen. It was weary, tinged with the sadness of 1,000 memories, but it was also filled with a new and powerful light. "I do not need a price, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I just need a lab, and a team that is not afraid of hard work. The vines, they deserve a chance to live." In that moment, the power dynamic of Sterling Vineyards was irrevocably rewritten. Not in a boardroom, not on a stock exchange, but right there in the dust between the rows, by a woman everyone had overlooked. The real work was about to begin. The days that followed were a blur of focused, relentless activity. Maria, now Dr. Flores to everyone, moved with an energy that seemed to defy the years of grinding manual labor that had stooped her shoulders. The quiet, almost invisible field hand was gone. In her place was a commander, a scientist, a force of nature. She established a makeshift field lab in a climate-controlled trailer Daniel had express delivered to the site within hours. Microscopes, Petri dishes, and chemical reagents appeared as if by magic, ordered with the full financial might of the Sterling Corporation, a power she now wielded with surgical precision. She handpicked her team not from the corporate agronomists with their pristine degrees and soft hands, but from the field workers themselves. She chose the ones she had observed for months, the ones with patient hands, sharp eyes, and a quiet respect for the plants. Men and women like Louis, who could tell a vine's thirst from 50 paces, and Alina, whose gnarled fingers could spot a spider mite from across a row. She taught them what to look for, the subtle halo of death on a leaf. She showed them how to prune the infected canes with the care of a surgeon, burning the cuttings in designated pits to ensure no spore escaped. She trained them to properly mix and apply the specialized fungicides, explaining the chemistry, the reason for every step. She didn't command them with fear as Gentry had. She led them with knowledge and a shared sense of purpose. They were no longer just laborers. They were soldiers in a war against the blight, and she was their general. They responded with a fierce loyalty and a work ethic that amazed the corporate onlookers who occasionally drove by in their air-conditioned. They were fighting for their vineyard, and for the woman who had always seen them as more than just cogs in a machine. Maria was the first to arrive each morning before the sun rose, when the air was cool and the dew, a potential vector for the disease, still clung to the leaves. She was the last to leave long after it had set, her face illuminated by the stark, sterile glow of her microscope. She meticulously mapped the spread of the infection on a large topographical map of the vineyard, using colored pins to mark new outbreaks. The red pins, marking the heart of the infection, were a terrifying cluster that she was determined to contain. She analyzed tissue samples, adjusted treatment protocols with the precision of a chess master, anticipating the fungus's next move. She and Daniel spoke every day, not as CEO and employee, but as partners in a desperate venture. He was humbled by her dedication, by the sheer depth of her expertise. He learned more about his own family business in those 2 weeks than he had in 10 years in the executive suite. He began to see the land not as a collection of assets, but as a complex, living ecosystem that his father had always understood. Her most frequent visitor, however, was Arthur Sterling. The old man would be driven out to the vineyard each afternoon. He wouldn't speak much. He would simply sit on a small stool near her field lab, watching her work, his presence a silent, steady source of support. He and Maria shared a unique bond, a communion that needed no words. They were the 2 people who had heard the vineyard's cry for help. Sometimes, she would bring a slide to him and let him peer through the microscope, showing him the enemy they were fighting on a cellular level. The microscopic, insidious spores of Gignardia bidwellii. He would look, his old eyes surprisingly sharp, and then nod, a look of deep understanding passing between them. His mind, which had seemed so clouded and lost to his family and colleagues, was now sharp and clear, anchored by the fight for his life's work. He was no longer a confused old man. He was a founding father, a guardian of the legacy. But the battle was far from easy. The first crisis struck a week into their campaign. A sudden, unseasonal thunderstorm rolled in from the west, a bruised purple mass of clouds that unleashed a torrential downpour. Maria and her team had just completed a painstaking, full-day application of a critical fungicide. The rain, a blessing in a normal season, was now a curse. It washed away the expensive treatment, leaving the vulnerable vines exposed. Worse, the splashing water was a perfect medium for spreading the fungal spores to previously untouched sections of the vineyard. The next morning, Maria's map was a nightmare. A dozen new yellow pins, indicating new small infections, had appeared on the northern edge of the property, across the firebreak they had established. The disease had jumped their quarantine. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket. The workers were demoralized. The executives in the distant city office, seeing the reports, began to panic. Daniel called her, his voice tight with anxiety. "The board is getting nervous, Maria. They're talking about containment failure. One of them suggested cutting our losses, just torching the entire lower quadrant to save the rest. If we do that, we lose 40% of the harvest," Maria countered, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. "And there is no guarantee it won't spread from spores in the soil next season. It would be a surrender, not a solution." That night, she stayed in the lab until the early hours of the morning. Surrounded by textbooks and research papers, she'd had Daniel overnight from university libraries across the country. The ghost of her husband, Javier, felt closer than ever. She could almost hear his voice, his relentless optimism in the face of impossible odds. "Look at the problem differently, me Ammer," he would have said. "The obstacle is the way." And then she found it. An obscure paper from a Japanese research institute on using adhesive polymers in agricultural sprays. A sticky, organic compound that would bind the fungicide to the leaves, making it resistant to rain for up to 72 hours. It was expensive, experimental, and the supply chain was a nightmare. Daniel had to pull every string he had, calling in favors from chemical suppliers in 3 different countries. For 48 agonizing hours, the fate of the vineyard hung in the balance. But the trucks arrived. The team, their hope renewed by Maria's unwavering resolve, worked through the night under portable floodlights to reapply the treatment. It was a massive gamble, a huge drain on the emergency budget. But it worked. The new infections were halted in their tracks. They had held the line. They had survived their first mini-boss. The struggle, however, was taking its toll on Maria. The long hours, the immense pressure, the ghosts of the past, it was a heavy burden. One evening, as she stared at the map, the red pins seeming to mock her, Arthur Sterling shuffled into the lab. He held out a steaming mug. "Chamomile," he said simply. "My wife used to say it could solve most of the world's problems." Maria took the mug, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. "Thank you, Arthur." He stood beside her, looking at the map. "That red patch, that's where the old creek bed used to be," he said, his voice distant. "We filled it in back in the 70s. The soil there, it never drains right. It's always held the damp. The rot loves the damp." It was a piece of information no survey map or soil analysis could provide. It was the living memory of the land. It was this wisdom, combined with her science, that gave them an edge. In these quiet moments, Maria found herself opening up to the old man, telling him about her life before, about her homeland, about Javier. She spoke of their shared dream of creating a research institute that would help small farmers, not just large corporations. A dream that had died with him on a dusty road thousands of miles away. "He would be proud of you, Maria," Arthur said, his watery eyes full of a kindness she hadn't experienced in years. "He is not gone, so long as you continue the work." This reflective pause, this brief moment of human connection, gave her the strength to face the next crisis. It came not from the sky or the soil, but from within the corporation itself. A vice president of operations, a man named Henderson who had been a Gentry loyalist and profited from his lax management, began to sow dissent. He fed the board of directors a constant stream of negative reports, highlighting the costs of Maria's methods, questioning her credentials, subtly suggesting she was an unknown, a risk. He argued for a cheaper, faster solution. A powerful, broad-spectrum chemical defoliant that would kill the fungus, but also poison the soil for years to come and render the grapes unsellable for this season. It was a scorched earth policy designed to cut immediate losses and make the quarterly report look better, the long-term health of the vineyard be damned. Daniel found himself in a war on 2 fronts, one in the fields and one in the boardroom. Henderson was charismatic and manipulative, playing on the board's fears. He presented Maria as a liability, a wild card who was running a multi-million-dollar experiment with their money. "We don't even know who this woman is," Henderson had argued in a video conference, his voice oozing false concern. "We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders to mitigate this disaster with proven, cost-effective methods, not with some refugee's pet project." The attack was vicious and personal. Daniel defended Maria fiercely, but the board was wavering. They demanded a full presentation, a justification for her strategy. Maria would have to face them. The prospect terrified her. She was a scientist, not a corporate politician. She was used to dealing with observable facts, not hidden agendas and power plays. The night before the presentation, she almost gave up. The weight of it all, the rot, the bored, the memory of what she had lost for speaking truth to power, was crushing. She sat in her small, rented room, her head in her hands, the ghost of defeat whispering in her ear. But then she thought of her team, of Louis and Elena who had placed their faith in her. She thought of Arthur who had looked at her and seen a peer, not a subordinate. She thought of the Vines themselves, their silent fight for life. She would not let them down. She walked into the sterile, intimidating video conference room the next day, flanked by Daniel, and to everyone's surprise, Arthur Sterling, who had insisted on being there. She didn't use a slick PowerPoint presentation. Instead, she placed a single, healthy grape leaf and a single, infected leaf on the polished table. She began to speak. She didn't talk about profit and loss. She talked about the life cycle of the fungus, the delicate balance of the soil's microbiome, the long-term health of the vines. She explained her methods not as an expense, but as an investment in the future, in the very soul of the Sterling legacy. Her passion, her profound and undeniable expertise filled the room. She was not asking for their permission. She was educating them. When she finished, there was silence. Henderson tried to rebut, but his arguments about cost-effectiveness sounded hollow and crass in the face of her deep, holistic understanding. It was Arthur who delivered the final blow. He looked into the camera, his voice frail but steady. For 50 years, I have listened to this land. It is speaking to us now. Dr. Flores is the only one who is truly listening. If you choose to ignore her, you are not just writing off a harvest. You are writing off this family, this company, and everything I have built. The choice is yours. The board voted. It was unanimous. Maria was given their full, unequivocal support. Henderson was sidelined, his power play defeated. They had overcome the second mini-boss, the enemy within. The turning point had been reached. Slowly, miraculously, their combined efforts began to turn the tide for good. The relentless march of the black rot slowed, then halted. The new leaves that emerged were a vibrant, healthy green, free of the telltale lesions. The remaining grapes, though fewer in number than projected, swelled on the vines, ripening under the late summer sun, their flavor concentrated and intense due to the stress the vines had endured. Maria had not just stopped the disease. She had saved the harvest. It wouldn't be the banner year Gentry had falsely promised, but it wouldn't be the catastrophe it was destined to become. It would be a year of survival, a year of triumph against impossible odds, a vintage born of fire and faith. The day they began the harvest was a day of quiet celebration. The machines rolled through the fields, their sounds no longer a monotonous drone, but a symphony of victory. Daniel and Arthur stood with Maria on a small rise overlooking the activity. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the rich, sweet scent of ripe grapes. "You did it," Daniel said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "You saved us, Dr. Flores." "We did it," Maria corrected gently, gesturing to the workers in the field below who were laughing and calling to each other, their faces filled with pride. "It took every one of us." Arthur Sterling reached out and placed his frail, trembling hand over hers. "You gave me back my vineyard, Maria," he said, using her first name for the first time, a sign of ultimate respect and affection. "But more than that, you gave me back my voice. Thank you." Maria looked out at the rows of green and purple, at the bustling activity, at the two men standing beside her. She had arrived at this place with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of ghosts. She had sought to be invisible, to disappear into the soil. But the land, in its infinite wisdom, had refused to let her. It had called on her, demanded her expertise, and in healing its sickness, she had begun to heal her own. She was no longer a ghost. She was Dr. Maria Flores, and she was home. Months later, the chill of late autumn had settled over the valley. The harvest was a memory, the vines now skeletal and dormant, resting for the winter. The final accounting had been done. They had lost nearly 15% of the crop, a significant financial hit, but far from the total devastation that had been imminent. The two as smaller, but the story behind it had already made it legendary among wine enthusiasts and industry insiders. The tale of the miracle harvest had spread. Sterling Vineyards was stronger than ever, its foundation rebuilt not on profit margins, but on resilience and truth. Maria, now permanently installed as the director of viticulture and research, stood in the vineyard's state-of-the-art laboratory. It was a facility she had designed herself, built to her exact specifications by a grateful Daniel Sterling. Gleaming stainless steel, humming centrifuges, and powerful electron microscopes had replaced the dusty trailer. Her new office window looked out over the very rows where she had once toiled under Gentry's abusive watch. It was a view of her past and her present, a constant reminder of the journey. She was reviewing soil analysis reports, planning for the coming season with a proactive strategy designed to strengthen the vine's natural immunity, when her junior assistant knocked on her door. "Dr. Flores, there's a man here for a preliminary interview, a seasonal position for the winter pruning crew." "Send him in, Carla," Maria said, not looking up from her charts. The door opened and a man shuffled in, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He clutched a worn, greasy cap in his hands, twisting it over and over. He smelled of cheap soap and desperation. "Please, have a seat," Maria said, still focused on her work, her pen making a note in the margin. "Thank you, ma'am," a voice mumbled. The voice was gravelly, broken, but horribly familiar, a ghost from the first day of her new life. Maria's head snapped up. Sitting across the polished mahogany desk from her was Mr. Gentry. He was thinner, his face gaunt and sallow. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a man. He didn't recognize her. In her crisp white lab coat, with her hair tied back neatly and a pair of professional glasses perched on her nose, she was no longer the anonymous field hand he had once terrorized. She was just another manager, another person holding power over his bleak future. He stared at a point just past her shoulder, reciting his qualifications in a monotone, a speech he had likely given 100 times in 100 different offices. "I've got extensive experience in vineyard management. Over 20 years, I know this land. I can work hard. I just need a chance." A cold, satisfying wave of poetic justice washed over Maria. Here he was, the man who had mocked her, who had stolen from her wages, who had tried to have her thrown out, now begging her for the most menial of jobs. The power reversal was absolute, the catharsis so complete it was almost overwhelming. She could have crushed him. She could have called security. She could have repeated his own cruel words back to him. "I don't pay people to be slow." The temptation was a bitter, coppery taste in her mouth. She could humiliate him as he had humiliated her. But as she looked at the broken man before her, she felt not triumph, but a profound sense of pity. He was a relic of a failed system, a system built on bullying and ignorance. His defeat was her victory, but gloating over it would diminish the very principles she now stood for. She had fought to save life, not to destroy it. She let him finish his desperate plea. Then she folded her hands on the desk and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Gentry," she said, her voice even and calm. For the first time, he looked her full in the face. A flicker of confusion crossed his features as his brain tried to place her. Then, his eyes widened in horrified recognition. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. His mouth opened, but again no sound emerged. He started to rise to flee, but his legs seemed to have forgotten how to work. "I remember you," Maria continued, her voice devoid of malice. "It was simple, factual. I remember you told me that my concern for small, injured things was a waste of time. You were wrong. It is in paying attention to the smallest details, a struggling bird, a tiny spot on a single leaf, that we find the truth. It is the foundation of everything we do here now. You don't have the eyes for this work." She stood up, the movement signaling the end of the interview, an act of mercy as much as dismissal. "The position has been filled. I wish you luck in your search, Mr. Gentry. Carla will show you out." He stumbled out of the office, not looking back, a man twice condemned, first by his own failure, and now by the quiet, unassailable grace of the woman he had wronged. Maria watched him go, then turned back to the window. She looked out at the sleeping vines standing in silent, ordered rows under the pale winter sun. They were safe, they were healthy, and they were hers to protect. And so their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. Wisdom can indeed be found in the humblest of places, and true strength is not in the voice that shouts the loudest, but in the one that speaks the quietest truth. But as one woman's integrity saves a system, how many others are crushed by systems that refuse to listen? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.